Welcome back to Cove Street Boatworks. It is September and we have been working on this Shepherd utility. There are some unique problems with the restoration of the Shepherd that I really haven't been able to get any really good answers for. The construction's different than you would see on a Chris Craft or on a Hacker Craft, for example. These boats were constructed using large sawn floor timbers out of mahogany, and they were fairly narrowly spaced in the boat. And then in between there was some fairly heavy, like 1x1 white oak intermediaries. But what's most unique about this, other than the framing construction itself with these solid floor frames, is the fact that the bottom didn't have any battens. So this is unlike Garwood's and Hacker Crafts and Chris Crafts, where they were able to put the diagonal planking on and fasten the thinner diagonal planking, about 1/4 of an inch thick, swept from front to back, on the battens to make the curvature. On this boat, they clench nailed, and the inner and the outer planking was questioned. How did they manufacture these? Nobody was underneath these boats, holding a bucking iron so that when the copper nail was driven on the outside on the seam of the last layer of planks, which ran fore and aft, that it clenched over the nail. And the nails were all clenched very, very uniformly. More than likely, the form that these were built on was in some way self-clenching. And I've searched the internet, I've asked a lot of the historians, I've never been able to find any pictures or anybody who could speak with any authority on how these boats were built. So it's sort of a fascinating conversation just from a historical context, but also what do we do with the restoration? So we have these mahogany sawn floor timbers, which, they're all Honduran mahogany for the most part, at least in this vintage boat. This is late 1940s. You don't want to replace it with Honduran mahogany. It's too expensive. It doesn't hold up very well. So do we do white oak, which is going to add a bit of weight to the lower area of the boat, which is not a bad thing, but it's certainly not original? Or do we do Philippine mahogany or something like that and just make sure that it's fairly well sealed and just go forward? But more importantly, when we put the, take one of the frames here, when we put these intermediate frames in, which are white oak, and we put them onto the boat, it doesn't give us a lot of surface area to connect these heavier 3/8 inner and outer planks to, especially if we're not clench nailing. So we could cut battens in this bottom floor section, but again, it's deviating from the original boat. And when people bring a boat in for restoration, they typically don't want you to put a Chris Craft bottom on a Shepherd. That's just not something that people like to see, although a lot of shops have done just that. The other thing we can do is, because of the construction of this boat, the way they constructed it, there's not as much hollow in the entry of this boat, on the bottom as you move toward the stem. On a Chris Craft or a Garwood, there can be a fair amount of hollow that takes place, and it makes the planks sort of a compound bend. It makes them a little more difficult to put on. But because the inner plank is only 1/4 of an inch and they have the battens there, we can usually manage it. It just takes a little bit of finesse. This boat you don't see as much hollow on. So I may be worrying about something that's really not going to be an issue, and this is what other restorers who have worked on Shepherd boats may have come across, is that with it being fairly flat or triangular in section as you go forward on the boat, it really may not be a consideration. And these intermediates and these heavier sawn frames, even with the spacing they're at, which is, I'm guessing here, maybe 10, 12 inches, maybe that's adequate to define the shape, and there's not too much of a compound bend, so maybe it won't be an issue at all. Time will tell. So the question for the owner will be, do we use mahogany for these sawn floor timbers, or do we use white oak? White oak certainly would hold up better, but it's going to be much heavier, and we're going to have to replace all of them. And there's a good number of them here, 10 or 12. And they're major pieces of timber, so there's a lot of board foot of material here. And then these intermediates are white oak. The chines are pretty beat up on here too. This is always a restoration question. Do we repair these chines or do we replace them? To be honest with you, from a restorer's point of view, A lot of times it's easier to replace them than it is to repair them, and it certainly helps you sleep at night because the repairs on a big structural timber like this, or on the keel, or on the stem, they may or may not hold up. Epoxy doesn't do a great job at gluing together large structural members because the ability of that material to expand or contract, the tension or the compression that that generates far exceeds the ability of epoxy to counteract. So a lot of times you'll get failures, or you'll get things that'll pull away. So it's not always a great way to do it, and scarfing in little pieces here and there, you know, it looks good, it's cheap, but is it gonna last the next 20 years? Probably not. So those are the conversations we have to have. What else do we want to talk about on this boat? There's a very interesting way that the chine plank on the side comes into the chine. There's a very strange shaped piece that that finishes it off, and I'll try to get some photos up to show you how this works. One side was sort of destroyed on this boat, but the other side we got off intact. It's going to be an amazing piece to machine. It's very, very tapered to a knife edge on one side, and very asymmetrical, but it marries the bottom to the top and allows you to overlap the inner ply on the bottom with the outer ply and the chine plank. So pretty interesting construction. The only other thing you'll notice on this boat that's sort of a departure is the longitudinals are laid flat. They're not on edge, which is sort of strange. I mean, it's easier to put them in flat. This may have had something to do with the form. If it was a self-clenching form, this may have been easier for them to locate, or actually form part of a strong back. I don't know. I don't know that I'll ever know, but it lacks longitudinal stiffness, right? They're Doug fir, or some kind of fur. I think they're Doug fir. They're in two-piece. They're lapped in the center and bolted through. So there's a lot of things that aren't traditional with that approach, that engineered design, when compared to Chris Craft or Dodge or Hackercraft, where they had fairly narrow or thin but tall longitudinals that were set on edge. And there was a lot of longitudinal stiffness to it, and it became the area where sawn floor timbers and everything were attached in between. So you had this cradle on the bottom of the boat that formed a lot of structure. And it helped the boat's trailer well after we got out of the 1920s and we began to move them around by car. This boat doesn't have that same kind of structure. Here the longitudinals are flat. They're going to be a little bit less stiff. And then we have these big sawn floor timbers. Together they're going to form that same kind of cradle, but across the whole boat. Where on Garwood's and Chris Craft's, it was from those longitudinals to the center of the boat. They didn't extend all the way out. So a very different philosophy in the way this boat was built and designed. I wish I had some more information on this. It's been very difficult to chase down any of the early Shepherd historical artifacts or even photos of the factory. If anybody has anything, please let me know. All right, well, thank you for hanging in there while we had a little bit of a break. That's about all we can talk about as far as the Shepherd initially. If you have any ideas on how you might approach this, or if you have any historical information, uncle or a grandparent that worked there, that can give us some insight as to how these things were constructed, that would be really, really interesting. I would love to see any artifacts that you might have. Until then, we'll be talking to the owner. We'll be going back and forth on what the best solution is. I'm probably going to recommend that we not put battens in the bottom of the boat, that we just go ahead and we're going to use 3/8 plywood, marine plywood on the inside, and then 3/8 probably Philippine mahogany on the outside, and probably 5200 in between, just to try to seal it up to give us a little bit more of a monocot structure, and just not use the clench nails, and we'll see how that goes. But if you have any other experience, please let us know. And again, thank you for supporting the channel. And we are going to try to be much more regular now with the material that we have. We have a lot of work in the shop because We haven't done much for most of the summer, so we're going to try to play catch up, and we're doing some updates to the shop. So soon we're going to have a temporary building out and back, and we're going to be able to clean a lot of the stuff that's in here out, so it should look a little bit better, and we should be able to get some better shots. So again, thank you for your support, and until next time, see ya.